Today, actually, given that I'm the first to speak on this panel, I thought I would take a little historical approach in some way in terms of setting the scene to some extent in terms of thinking about U.S.-China relations, but especially from the Chinese perspective. I want to do so partly because in many ways what is going on today in China is this continuing struggle for modernity that the Chinese have been going through. I see the Chinese, and in fact, as I mentioned that, in my mind there is a complexity of notions, of complications that are associated with it. For example, when we think actually going back to the Qing dynasty, the late Qing, really is a Manchu-ruled empire, an empire that was weak given the times and all that. And it's actually a time of there was hardly any nationalism, if there was any. In fact, the Qing dynasty was perfectly happy to bring in the Brits to crack down on the Taiping Rebellion within China, the Qing, for example. Even during the time of the first Sino-Japanese War, there were many Chinese who were happily ferrying, helping the Japanese who actually were making incursions into the Qing dynasty at that point. And even during the Boxer Rebellion, in fact, in 1900, again, you can just a whole body of literature on those issues and all that. But of course, it's also the Qing dynasty that actually brought China this huge geographical expanse, and its partial dismemberment at that time left us legacies that continue to be issues of today, including, for example, Hong Kong, Macau, those Taiwan, and Korea. So in that sense, actually, think about it, a time of a weak state, weak nationalism in many ways, but with very enduring legacies in that. And following that came the Republic of China. And I think compared to other empires, the transition from the Qing imperial system to the Republic was actually a fairly bloodless. Only about 3,000 people died. 3,000, of course, is a large number, but for a country of almost 500 million people around that time, actually 3,000. But of course, what happened is not a process that's easily concluded. And partly, we Americans had a role to play in that because the first provisional constitution of the Republic of China was in fact modeled on the U.S. Constitution. Most of us don't realize it. Most Chinese don't know it, in fact. And then, of course, it's the American who advised this first president of, well, the second president, actually, the first real president, Yuan Shikai, to become an emperor. Is a political scientist from Columbia University by the name of Frank Goodnow. Some of you actually know. I see some old Columbians here, in fact. But of course, the Republic of China did not have the strength. It had difficulties in bringing things together. And of course, eventually, even though there was growing nationalism over time, and in fact, in many ways, the Japanese invasion helped to kindle that nationalism with the beginning in the 1930s also. The Republic of China then did quite well in many ways internationally. Some of you may remember the picture of Chiang Kai-shek sitting alongside President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. In fact, the Republic of China was a founding member of the United Nations. So China did not need to stand up after the Republic of China. China already was among the greatest nations at that point in a way. And this Republic of China actually did continue the membership in the UN until 1971 in that. But of course it fell. It fell on the mainland in this. And then that brings us to the Cold War era, in fact, to sort of very interesting in many ways. I've been doing some reviews lately of this issue. Of course, the first phase of this era, we had a remarkably strong party state. The Communist Party rule was very tough, many of us know very well. There was intense xenophobia, actually really started and with the rallies in the Korean War. The Korean War in China known as Resist America Aid Korea campaign, right, with a group of so-called Chinese volunteers doing nothing. They were certainly not volunteers. China then, the PRC now, was excluded from the Bretton Woods system. In fact, as soon as the Korean War happened, in June 1950, President Truman sent the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait, and that meant Taiwan, the unification couldn't happen. Of course, Korea, the legacy continues today. And of course, the PRC was excluded from the UN for many years. And Bob earlier was mentioning the 1960s considerations in the US elections and so on. So the Nixon visit to China was pivotal in this regard. But of course, it's just not Nixon opening China. It's Mao and others deciding that they wanted Nixon to come as well. You need to tangle. And in that sense, actually, it's truly remarkable because the swing of China from being allied with the Soviet Union to being against the Soviet Union played a pivotal role also that we don't often recognize in hastening the demise of the Soviet Union eventually. And of course, it's also laid the ground for the future, the opening up in the post-war years, in fact. So China actually in the early 1980s in particular, during the Cold War era, the best of relations between the US and China were during that time. We didn't have a lot of interactions in trade or technology and all that, but the US was sending listening stations to China to listen to on the Soviet Union. We were practical allies in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. We were helping with the predecessor, by the way, of the Taliban, actually, just for history's sake. So today, we have a China, therefore, that has grown rapidly, very successful, with a strong party state, nationalist sentiments as well. But American perceptions of China, the PRC, has not recovered the warmth that it gained in 1988, right before the student protests and so on. But since then, of course, we all know the story, China's rise in terms of economy, in terms of trade and all that. China has benefited dramatically from the open system of global trading, is actually a major beneficiary of the existing Bretton Woods system. The US in this context is very important, and we need to remind the Chinese how open we have been to Chinese exports, actually, so sort of for a very, very sustained period. In the process, China has been able to increase its shares in the IMF and the World Bank as well. In fact, under the charter of the World Bank, whoever becomes the largest economy eventually, the World Bank would be stationed in that country. So technically, in fact, if the Chinese economy continues to grow, it's only a matter of time before the headquarters of the World Bank will move to Beijing. You go to the Beijing office, they'll remind you that that's in the charter right there. So in other words, China will not be excluded from this system. But nonetheless, in the reforms of those institutions, our Congress have not been willing to open the space, so to speak. And that actually has prompted China to feel like it's being sort of maltreated to some extent, and we'll come to that a little bit. But nonetheless, China has a major say already in those institutions. It also has a major say in global antitrust. Every major global merger today, because those companies, or at least one party, has a major role in China, now has to go to China for approval. And that's, again, something that we don't tend to recognize. So how China has done in this regard? In the international institutions, we already mentioned, actually, China has been very concerned about who makes the rules. But generally, those institutions have the generality rules, anti-discrimination. So China generally has actually done very well, taking advantage of it. In the WTO, I should mention, I had a student who took a look at tally the numbers. China has been very, in the beginning, China was actually on the recipient of many lawsuits. But gradually, China has become a very good player, very often bringing in the best lawyers from the United States to argue for it. And today, it actually does fairly well when it launches lawsuits in the WTO against others, just like the others do against China. So it depends on who lodges the lawsuit, essentially, in this. But as China has grown, there are the other side. Trade, of course, theoretically is welfare enhancing. But China has become, for example, very dependent on agricultural imports. And it's actually a reflection of competitive advantage. You think about it. China lacks land, lacks water. It imports this in the form of grains, for example, from the Midwest, essentially. China also has become the world's largest importer of minerals, and in particular, hydrocarbons. But this is a striking picture if you look at it. Much of the oil going to China goes through one point. If you are a Chinese leader, you wonder about this, right? So sort of because you see this is a choke point potentially. What do? You want to overcome it. Are there other sources? Russia, for example, you get it by rail. From Central Asia, you can get it by pipeline, right? Can you open up some other pipeline or route, right? Natural, essentially, to think about this in many ways. But overall, though, I think actually China is uneasy about this, but overall it's one of the 5 members of the UN, permanent members of the UN Security Council. It has influence in the IMF and World Bank, and the World Bank has already had one Chinese economist as chief economist, someone who happens to have graduated from the University of Chicago. And of course, overall, though, it's been frustrated with some of those institutions. As a result, in recent years, it helped to build the BRICS Bank. It's also recently developed the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. I think the US made a fundamental mistake in not trying to say we can play a role in changing, in making sure the institution plays by global terms by joining it. Instead, we try to lobby against it, and in the end, it turned out actually that didn't help. Likewise, we've been working, the other front has been, we've been working on the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and in trying to say, oh, China has not been playing as good a role as we would have liked in the WTO, therefore we set up a new set of rules in that. But in one area, the two countries, the US and China, have done really well is to see the global climate as a true global common. So our private, actually, is a sort of interest. It's in the private interest of the 2 largest emitters of the world to get together and say, oh, this is our problem. It's not just a global problem. So large countries have a larger responsibility, and therefore the US and China worked very well. Despite the tensions, the 2 countries got together in 2014 to forge agreement for China to reach peak emissions by 2030, and that helped to set the tone for the Paris talks in there. But in the one area China has really been promoting very heavily, President Xi has been doing so, is the One Belt, One Road system in terms of foreign policy. But you look at this, actually, isn't it interesting? A lot of this One Belt, One Road map, you're reaching to the Middle East, reaching to Europe, and you look at the oil route, is actually pretty similar. It's China's way to build, to strengthen relations, to both to promote exports, investments, but also to stabilize what it has to face in terms of the economy and so on. Now, in terms of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, however, since China has been excluded from the negotiations, what China has been doing is to promote a 16-nation regional comprehensive economic partnership under the aegis of the APEC in this. But nonetheless, actually, China is not simply saying we don't want to trade. In many forums, China continues to advocate more open markets, and especially, of course, it wants others to open their markets to China. But overall, though, they actually have become one of the flag carriers for a more open trading system, signing quite a number of free trade deals with neighboring countries and so on. Now, with all those worries, but as this economy continues to grow, and with 1 minute left, I think actually I just simply want to emphasize China is natural. The British patrolled its ceilings, the US patrolled its ceilings, and continues to do so. In fact, China in recent years has been participating in the UN peacekeeping. in the Gulf of Eden, for example. It actually is the largest contributor among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council in terms of UN peacekeeping. And it's natural, therefore, it wants to build a naval presence and so on. But as it does so, remember the historical legacies. The historical legacies are the Taiwans, and so on, the islands in the South China Sea, the East China Sea. And in this, of course, it's natural for China to assert itself in this process. And of course, to the extent that the US has the Taiwan Relations Act, China seizes really. Of course, in the past, it doesn't have the energy or the power. Now it has the power it wants to build, and in order to counter that, what does that create? A security dilemma, essentially. But of course, I've ran out of time, and therefore I'll stop here and leave some of the remaining issues to my colleagues. Thank you.